Hello, everyone. We're going to talk about the horrific impacts of childhood neglect on adult relationships. And I think one of the difficulties with neglect is that it's passivity in nature. It's kind of passive. It's not doing something. Many times we're much more aware of abuse and difficulties because of what parents may be doing. Now, I certainly believe neglect is doing something, but it's more of a passive of not doing something. And that's sometimes harder to identify, realize, or even realize maybe I've been impacted by that. And so I want to talk about some ways in which we do experience neglect and some pointers and some resources that I can give you about healing. The bad news is neglect is no fun and it stretches on into problems into adulthood. The good news is we can recover and we can heal. There are things that we can do. So let me talk about the impact of childhood neglect on adult relationships. Well, if we have been neglected in any number of ways, it shapes and informs how we see the world around us. If we've grown up in families that have been dysfunctional, we end up seeing the world in a very, very unsafe way. We don't feel comfortable in the world because we didn't feel nurturing and comforted when we were growing up and when we needed that comfort or needed that help or attention or nurturance. And so we go, basically, this world is not a very friendly world to be in. And that's kind of our adult orientation. It could be unconscious. Many people even will consciously feel that way. And that can happen as a result of neglect. We may not see the world as very caring. If I didn't get that kind of caring growing up, well, the world just really doesn't care. There aren't people who care out there. And I'm going to question that caring because I grew up believing just nobody's going to be there for me. Nobody's just going to be there. And that might even be suspect or suspicious to us. And then trusting is a very, very high risk for us. Trusting others, trusting the world, trusting life, because I just didn't get that kind of confidence and nurturance growing up. And so why would I feel that way now as an adult? And oftentimes we don't. I hope you will subscribe to my channel. I hope you'll comment on this video. I hope you will like it. And I hope that could be something that might be of help to you. Childhood neglect can take many forms. First of all, emotional neglect. It's a deficit. Love was scarce. Our anxiety system wasn't nurtured or comforted in those ways when there's been neglect. And we may have little feeling with regard to warmth or comfort. We just don't feel full of that. And what we many times feel is a hole that's kind of left inside of us how do I ever get that hole filled? The many clients I've worked with will describe they have that hole, and then we'll try to fill it with any number of things. Second of all, we can certainly have physical neglect. Physical neglect can later affect our health. That could be our teeth, our ability to self-heal. There can be many organs that don't work as well because we didn't get the care we needed when we were growing up. I know in my case, I wish I would have been able to have braces. I think that would have been a good thing. And they were very expensive when I was younger, but I think it would have been a good thing to have. And I would probably have better health dental care even now. Our self-care habits may be poor. Many who have been neglected don't want to go to doctors, don't go to psychiatrists, lawyers, accountants, professionals we use for self-care. In addition, we may not see a therapist because you just don't do that. You just don't take care of yourself. That's not what I learned growing up. And that maybe we had ADHD growing up. Maybe we had depression growing up, but it never got noticed. It never got checked out. And then I've known some people that had more serious problems that never got checked out, never got noticed, because parents were just not very attentive to those things. And when we are neglected physically or medically, that can be a problem for us as adults. And those habits can continue. There can be financial neglect. Maybe we lack the appropriate clothing. Maybe we lack appropriate food that other kids had around us. Good shoes, or good shoes for school, or good shoes for sports. Maybe little or no help with a first car. Maybe no help in getting a driver's license. Maybe no help with college. Maybe no help with advanced classes in high school, and those would have been good for you. And maybe we have also been parentified, which is also another neglectful type of dynamic, where not only I'm neglected, but my role is to take care of you as the parents. And I have many clients who were neglected and parentified. And so we have a double problem of both neglect and parentification. So out of our limited to no resources, we had to help the adults around us. And that can be very harmful for us as kids, and it can show up in adult ways. We know when a child grows up in an environment that's lacking love, support, and stability, it can lead to developmental and emotional problems that can carry over into adulthood. This can affect the ability to form and maintain healthy relationships, leading to issues such as trust, as I've mentioned, intimacy, communication problems. The impact of childhood neglect can also manifest in other areas of life, such as work, social relationships, and it can have a profound impact on a person's overall well-being. Neglect is a serious form of abuse. But again, it's considered kind of the lower stepsister for abuse. You didn't get beaten, you didn't experience severe abuse in those kinds of ways, but it can be very damaging to not have your needs met. And I'm not talking about everybody needed a wave runner for the lake, you needed a boat, I'm not even talking about those things. I'm talking about some basic things that we needed growing up. And certainly emotionally, again, I think anybody can be a parent. It takes much more effort to get a driver's license than to become a parent. There's no test drive of being parenting. There's no grading for that. Everybody just can be. Well, many people are not ready to be, and many are not able. There are many that don't even want to be, but because of their circumstances, they do. But that may end up in either abuse or neglect for the kids. Or we have different reasons for having kids. I need to have kids because that's what my church says. I need to have kids because that's what society says. I need to have kids so they can take care of me when I get older. These kids are more prone to maybe being neglected because they didn't have the parents to love, nurture, care for, and help them and launch them to be healthy adults. So what are some of the other effects childhood neglect can have on us as adults? Number one, self-neglect in adulthood and in adult relationships. When we weren't nurtured, when we were neglected as a child, guess what we internalize? Now I'm going to neglect myself. And so I learned to neglect myself. Secondly, when we've grown up with neglect, we end up having a pseudo-self or a no-self. And we have a pseudo-self or a no-self in adulthood that affects us in our ability to form healthy relationships. Because if you take a no-self into a relationship, what's going to happen in that relationship? It's not going to be healthy. You're going to reenact patterns from the past, and that repetitive pattern that we will do again from growing up. And we're basically going to end up in a relationship in which we are probably neglected again. And we find somebody who will neglect us. That's when we have that pseudo-self or no-self. A pseudo-self is a self that is formed on the basis of adapting to others and being controlled by others. Now, another way you could talk about that is codependency. When we say a pseudo-self, it's kind of a family systems way of saying codependency. Often a lot of codependency theory, a lot of codependency recovery is based on seeing one as an individual. I like to base it on all the relationships we are tied to and connected with. And so pseudo-self is a good term for that, or no self. We have no self in the system. We have a pseudo-self, adaptive self in the relationships. Thirdly, we can have difficulty in setting boundaries, both internal and external boundaries. You ever had trouble setting boundaries, knowing what boundaries to set, setting boundaries and then having them trampled and then not knowing what to do about it? That's a very common thing for adults who grew up in neglectful homes. Neglect can impact the development of healthy boundaries, leading to difficulties in setting limits, protecting oneself in relationships, and then also having trouble with internal boundaries and being able to resist things that are coming into me internally. We don't have enough of the I don't care about that or so what. We don't have enough of that. And so we tend to, as Ross Rosenberg talks about, we tend to absorb, not to observe. And if you're absorbing, you don't have strong internal boundaries. That absorbing is the not having good internal boundaries. And we have difficulties withstanding attacks from others, rather than I know who I am and it doesn't matter what you think feeling. That solid self, we don't have that if we grew up in a neglectful family. Number 4, not having healthy strategies to resist resistance from others. Whenever we operate in the world, we're always going to come up against resistance. That's normal. If I'm going to be myself, that often does not fit well in the system in which I've always been this other self. If I want to be myself or a newer self, I'm going to come up to resistance. And if you've been neglected growing up, you may have difficulty with resisting resistance. When we try to be ourselves, others resist us, and we tend to cave in and return to the dysfunctional status quo. Our emotional and mental legs feel like they're made out of jelly, and we don't feel we are standing on something. We don't have that experience. It doesn't feel strong in that way. We may get up enough courage to say, okay, well, I want to tell them how I feel. I want to share this with my friend. I want to tell my mother or father this, or my siblings, and I would like to kind of stand up for myself. But if our legs are made of jelly, then we're not going to be standing up for very long to resist their resistance so that they can have time to absorb our change. Now, they may never accept or absorb our change. That's fine. But we have to be fine with that. And most of us have a hard time with that. Number 5, we tend to have an other focus versus self-focus in thinking and feeling, which is, again, kind of, many people are familiar with codependency. Codependency is an other focus rather than a self-focus. And we're so other-focused that self gets neglected again. We then end up neglecting ourselves. Codependents neglect themselves, and they just carry on the internalized neglect that they had growing up as children. We use the filter and lens of seeing everything in an other-focused way versus a self-focused way. Neglect knocks us out of our own consideration, mentally, emotionally, even physically, even like with abuse. So many times someone who grew up in a home in which there was a lot of neglect going on, again, can get into a relationship that's physically abusive. And because I can't take care of myself emotionally, mentally, even physically, and I'll find myself in those kinds of relationships. So again, we want to be self-focused rather than other-focused. But neglect creates this other-focused way of looking at the world. Number 6. We have difficulty in managing emotions and needs. All kids have emotions. All kids have needs. All kids have wants. Not always are they mature in their wants, needs, and emotions. I understand that. But we all have them. But if there is neglect, it then can result in emotional dysregulation. And when we have that neglect, we don't know what to do with our wants, needs. We don't know how to communicate very well. We don't know when to communicate. We don't know what to do after we've communicated. We didn't have that practice and that experience if we were neglected. We need parents who are interacting with us in a caring, nurturing, loving way so that I can begin to practice having needs, having wants. Those will mature as we get older if parents will allow us to have them, allow us to deal with those, and be somebody that we can bounce off of in a healthy way without fear of punishment, shaming, and all of those things that can go on sometimes. So we can have difficulty communicating, expressing our needs and emotions, and this leads to problems in relationships. Then guess who we will find as a partner? Somebody that doesn't have an easy time with our needs, our emotions, and our communication. And we'll find somebody who has difficulties with that. Not understanding our needs, making it challenging to manage emotions and to control our reactions in relationships. And so what I find is if you grew up in a neglectful home, you'll find yourself doing the pendulum life. It's what I call. Here is where I completely give in, and here is where I totally get reactive. It's kind of what I call a victim and Viking pole or swing. And we didn't learn growing up to stay in the 90-degree mark. We were the 0 or 180. And so in adult relationships, we do the same thing. And that causes lots of problems, communication difficulties, conflicts, because we're just not kind of solid with us. And if I have jelly legs and I'm not very solid with emotions, my wants, needs, or boundaries, how is this relationship going to operate very well? Probably not so good. And we're going to have heartaches and hurts and losses, those kinds of things. Number 7, if we grew up in a house in which neglect was common, we end up with an allergy to intimacy. This is a phrase that I use in which we want and yearn and crave for intimacy, and we want closeness. We want to be loved and me love someone else and care about them, but we have a strong allergy to it. And so as we begin to get closer, kind of like horseshoe magnets, and if you take those magnets and as you move them closer, what happens? The closer they move towards each other, they will then do what? And many people say, oh, they will clump together like that. No, that's if they're opposite with each other. But if the poles are the same, they'll come close and then turn away from each other. As the closer they get, the force will force them away. And that's how I conceive of that allergy to intimacy. I want that intimacy. I'm coming closer, but boom, I can't. I can't deal with that. I don't feel comfortable with that. It doesn't feel right. Neglect can negatively impact the development of emotional and interpersonal skills, leading to difficulties in forming intimate relationships. I want to find somebody I can be intimate with, but I don't think the world is safe. I don't think it's, I don't trust anybody. And so as I find someone then it starts going like that. Magnets start to move away from each other and we start to feel and have problems. And often when that happens, when people have been married for a while and it goes like that, that's when they come in to see me and go, I don't know what's going on. We're not operating very well. And we can have conflicts about intimacy. We crave it, but I have an allergy to it. And that conflict operates less if we begin to resolve that conflict of craving for intimacy, but can't stand it in deep within us. We are allergic to too much intimacy or closeness, and it can raise too much anxiety for those who are adult children of neglectful families. Number 8, loneliness and a struggle to feel like you belong. Now, why would that be? Well, if I grew up in a home in which I was neglected, does a neglected person feel like they belong? You ever been to a party when you were in high school, junior high, grade school, whatever, and everybody was talking to everybody but not you? You feel lonely and you don't feel like you belong. Well, if we grew up that way in our family, we're just not important. We're just not a focus. And we have that neglect. That can be a real problem for us as adults because we internalize that. And then as adults, we begin to live our lives that way. And if you are entering a relationship, if you're finding a spouse or a mate or starting a family or whatever you're doing, to heal your loneliness or to feel like you belong, oftentimes we'll end up repeating the patterns of our childhood. While relationships are having a companion, somebody who's with you, somebody you may share things with, maybe things in common, maybe love, maybe your bodies, maybe, and you're sharing these things, that's not the same as fixing your loneliness. And it doesn't necessarily fix your belongingness. Those are deeper issues. And often relationships don't fix that. People will say, oh, well, just go find some friends to be with. No, you'll go and find friends to be with, and then you'll still feel lonely and you'll still feel like you don't belong. But you'll have more friends. That's great. But it isn't others that fix that problem. And that's why we want to be self-focused. It's not others that's going to fix that. Just like if you have a fear of abandonment or you have abandonment issues. Do getting into relationships fix abandonment issues? Well, if it does, I want you to tell me who that is, and I've got a lot of people I want them to meet. It doesn't fix those internal deep issues. If I feel abandonment, and if I fear abandonment, that's my issue to fix. It's not fixed by somebody else. And oftentimes we'll end up in that relationship as adults, blaming them for abandoning us again in our life. That's what will end up happening. Adult children of neglect often feel lonely and just feel like they don't belong. When they grew up in neglect, it was telegraphed to them, you don't belong. It maybe was never spoken. Many things are not spoken to children. And in fact, I wish many times they would be. But of course, we can't be that real and that honest in most families. But they will pick up the message that I don't belong. Even if nobody ever says, you don't really belong. But you don't belong because we're not noticing you. We're not meeting your needs. We're not taking care of you in a healthy way. So then we end up being caught between come close, stay away. And that's, I want the intimacy, but I'm allergic to it. And now all of our relationships are like this. Come close, stay away. Come close, stay away. And then we go, why can't I just have a nice, calm, healthy relationship? Why is there always struggles? Because I'll say, oh, come close. And as they come close, now I'm going to start conflict or struggles or arguments with them to push them away. So I'm saying, come, but stay away. Come, but stay away. And maybe you found that in your marriages, boyfriends, girlfriends, and your partners. And you have that kind of dynamic happening. And in fact, I think it even happens even within families, parents, siblings. There'll be this come close, stay away dynamic that is really problematic and painful. So, childhood neglect can impact adult relationships. Understanding and addressing these issues can be an important step in healing and forming healthy relationships. What I would suggest in terms of first steps, find a coach, a therapist, a pastoral counselor, someone that you can work with that you trust, who can help you with some of these dynamics. You can join a 12-step support group, Codependent Anonymous. There's adult children of dysfunctional family groups. There's ACOA groups. And often ACOA groups will include other people who have dysfunctional families. You can begin to become more of a student of the effects of neglect. And that can require some learning. And you can do some reading about that. And this video is not a replacement for getting the help you personally need, but I hope it will do some direction for you maybe you would understand you're not alone. There are many people who experience this, and it may make some sense as to why you have some of those symptoms. Learn more about the work of self-differentiation and getting your family of origin out of you. I even have a workshop on that. Getting your family of origin out of you. The last word is, since you were neglected, start working on not neglecting you. People say, well, what do I do to heal from growing up with neglect? Work on not neglecting you. Because that's what we tend to do, is repeat and internalize what we had growing up. And now that's how we relate to us. So you can begin to go, oh, well, how are the ways that I've been neglecting myself? Ooh, maybe you could write a list about that. How are the ways that you neglect you time and time again? Working on reducing that list, in which you start focusing on you. Now that I've listed some of the effects, let me give you some resources that might be of help to you. The book Running on Empty, Overcome Your Childhood Emotional Neglect by Janice Webb. Another book, Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, How to Heal from Distance, Rejecting, or Self-Involved Parents, because that will also be neglect, by Lindsay Gibson. The book Neglect, The Silent Abuser. And that's kind of what I was talking about before. Neglect is not so technicolor. It's one thing to say, hey, I was beaten with a belt all the time. That's much more technicolor. Very painful, horrific, horrible experience. But it's hard to say, I was neglected growing up as a child. And then many people go, well, so what? And no, it's a very real thing. It's just as real as other abuse. Neglect, the silent abuser. How to recognize and heal from childhood neglect. Enid Gray, Gray. To work more on finding yourself and self-differentiation work, which is what I specialize in. Inner Bonding by Margaret Paul. Growing Yourself Up by Jenny Brown. And Extraordinary Relationships by Roberta Gilbert. I hope that you will continue your work and recovery from neglect. I do want to thank you very much. Please subscribe, like, comment on the video. Begin today to love yourself. I want to thank you for joining me today. Have a great day and be wise.